Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. The most disturbing terminals in Fallout history. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the ruins, to a quiet vigil beside the glowing screens of a dead civilization's most private confessions. Tonight we explore the terminals that outlasted everything, the blinking green text preserved in collapsed buildings and sealed vaults, the records no one expected anyone to survive to read. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let your mind drift through the dust and the dark. There is no need to hold on to every word. Simply let these voices reach you across 2 centuries of silence, as patient and as persistent as the machines that kept them. Close your eyes when you are ready, and let us begin. Before a single terminal entry can be properly understood, it is necessary to understand what a terminal actually is not, in the technical sense that the pre-war world would have applied to the word, but in the deeper sense that 2 centuries of nuclear aftermath have given it. In the pre-war world, a terminal was simply a piece of office equipment. It was the computer workstation that sat on a desk in a government office or a corporate research facility or a vault administrator's chamber connected to a network, used for the ordinary tasks of institutional record-keeping and internal communication. It processed data, it stored files, it allowed the organizations that owned it to maintain the documentary infrastructure that all complex institutions require in order to function. In this respect, it was no more remarkable than a filing cabinet or a telephone, a tool for the management of information, mundane in itself, significant only in what it contained. What transformed the terminal from a mundane piece of office equipment into something approaching a sacred object was the particular combination of the Great War's comprehensiveness and the pre-war world's engineering standards. The bombs that fell on October 23rd, 2077, destroyed everything that could be destroyed and preserved. Through the specific physics of their destruction, certain categories of things that their designers had built to survive exactly this kind of catastrophic event. The government and military terminals of the pre-war era had been constructed to specifications that assumed the possibility of nuclear war, because the possibility of nuclear war had been built into the strategic calculus of the pre-war world for decades before the bombs actually fell. Hardened storage media, sealed housings, power systems capable of drawing from backup sources that the blast could not reach. The same civilization that had failed to prevent its own destruction had built its record-keeping systems to outlast it, and in doing so had created something it had not intended, a documentary record of itself that was more complete and more honest than any civilization had ever left behind. The word honest deserves examination here, because honesty was not the property that the pre-war civilization was trying to preserve when it built its terminals to survive nuclear attack. The property it was trying to preserve was operational continuity, the ability of government and military functions to continue operating even after the most extreme disruption imaginable. The terminals were hardened so that the institutions that used them could keep working. The institutions that used them did not survive. What survived instead was everything those institutions had recorded in the assumption that their records would remain internal, that the audience for their documentation would always be the same institutional audience for which the documentation had been prepared. The bombs did not just destroy cities and infrastructure and human lives. They destroyed the intended context of every document that the terminals contained, and in doing so, transformed those documents from internal records into something that had no precedent, the complete and unguarded private archive of a civilization that no longer existed to control access to its own records. This is the quality that distinguishes the Wastelands terminal network from every other form of documentary evidence that survives from the pre-war world. The pre-war world also left behind its physical ruins, its salvageable technology, its mutated descendants in the form of the ghouls who had lived through the bombing and its various iterations. But these forms of evidence all share a characteristic that the terminal record does not. They have been filtered, in one way or another, by the passage of time and the processes of transformation. The ruins have been weathered and scavenged and partially reclaimed by 2 centuries of ecological recovery. The technology has been used and modified, and in many cases, broken and repurposed beyond recognition. The ghouls who remember the pre-war world carry those memories through the transforming medium of 2 centuries of additional experience, which means that what they remember has been processed through everything that happened to them after the bombing, and is therefore not quite the same as what they originally knew. The terminals are different. Their contents are exactly what they were on the day they were last written to. The meeting minutes recorded in a Vault-Tec executive's terminal on October 22, 2077, are the same meeting minutes they were the day before the bombs fell, not filtered through time, not processed through experience, not transformed by anything that happened subsequently. They are a direct window into the institutional mind of the pre-war world at the moment before everything changed, and the view through that window is something that no amount of physical archaeology could have provided. The essential and defining quality of this view is its unguardedness. The pre-war world maintained, as all societies maintain, a careful distinction between the face it presented to itself in public and the reality it recorded in private. This distinction was not simply hypocrisy, though it included hypocrisy. It was a fundamental feature of how institutions operate the necessary gap between the public language in which institutions describe themselves and the internal language in which they actually conduct their business. Government press releases describe the resource wars as humanitarian interventions and liberation operations. Corporate advertising presented products of genuinely questionable safety as innovative contributions to consumer well-being. Political speeches framed increasingly desperate and increasingly authoritarian measures as regrettable but necessary protections of the freedoms they were in the process of dismantling. None of this was unusual. Every society that has ever existed has maintained some version of this gap between its public face and its private operations. What was unusual was that the particular catastrophe that ended the pre-war civilization destroyed the mechanisms that had kept the private face private, while leaving the private face itself perfectly intact. The result is something that the pre-war world's most committed advocates of institutional transparency could not have engineered deliberately: a complete record of what was actually happening behind the public. Language, available to anyone who survives to find a powered terminal in a collapsed building and reads what appears on the screen. This includes documents that their authors wrote in the full expectation that they would be read only by the institutional colleagues for whom they were intended. The internal memos acknowledging dangers that the public-facing communications denied. The research logs documenting experiments that the published results sanitized beyond recognition. The personal journals of individuals trying to make sense of their own complicity in things that their private moral judgment assessed very differently from their professional participation. The terminal record contains all of this, and the fact that it was never intended to be read by anyone outside its original institutional context is precisely what makes it so complete and so illuminating. The range of what the terminals contain is as varied as the range of human activity that produced them. At one extreme are documents of such comprehensive institutional horror that they are difficult to read without confronting questions about what human beings are capable of when they organize themselves into systems powerful enough to insulate institutional decisions from the human consequences of those decisions. The experimental protocols of the Vault program, written in the clinical language of research science and authorizing the systematic abuse of thousands of people who had been told they were being protected, represent this extreme in its most complete form. At the other extreme are documents so ordinary so embedded in the mundane texture of daily life, that their horror is entirely a function of context. The scheduling note written by someone who would be dead within hours, the supply requisition for materials that would never be used, the lunch order placed on a terminal that would still be displaying it 200 years later, when someone who had never known the person who placed it sat down at the keyboard. The scale of what was lost becomes legible, not in the large documents, but in the small ones, because the large documents describe atrocities, and the mind can hold atrocities at some analytical distance, while the small documents describe the specific texture of specific lives, and the mind has no distance from those. Between these extremes, the terminal record contains everything that the institutions and individuals of the pre-war world recorded about themselves. Scientific research that ranged from genuinely beneficial to catastrophically harmful, administrative decisions that ranged from thoughtful to monstrous, personal reflections that ranged from banal to profound. The record is not unified by a single theme or a single moral. It is unified only by the accident of preservation, by the fact that the hardened storage media of the pre-war era happened to be durable enough to outlast the civilization that had filled them, and that the people who now move through the wasteland happen to have the means and the motivation to read what has been preserved. The survivors who read these terminals are performing an act that is, in the fullest sense, an act of witness. The dead who wrote these documents left no other way to be known. They have no living advocates, no institutional representatives, no community of memory that preserves their specific reality against the distortions of time. What they have is what they wrote. In whatever unguarded moments of internal communication and private reflection the terminal record has preserved. To read these documents carefully, to pay attention to what they actually say, rather than to what we might expect them to say. To take seriously the humanity that is visible even in the records of the most terrible institutional decisions. This is the closest thing available to honoring the reality of people who are otherwise completely beyond reach. It is also, and not incidentally, the prerequisite for understanding the world that those people produced. The wasteland is not simply a physical consequence of nuclear war. It is a social and institutional consequence of everything that the terminal record documents, the accumulated result of decisions made by real people operating within real institutions under real constraints, decisions whose full implications were sometimes understood and sometimes not, sometimes considered and sometimes deliberately avoided. Reading the terminals is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is the process by which the wasteland's survivors come to understand, in the most specific and unguarded terms available, exactly what they have inherited and exactly what produced it. The most systematic and most comprehensive documentary record of deliberate human suffering preserved in that terminal network belongs to a corporation that had built its public identity around the salvation of humanity. The records of Vault-Tec, scattered through the hardened terminals of its corporate headquarters and the vault facilities it administered, constitute the first, and in many respects, the foundational horror of what the terminal record contains, the documentary evidence of a betrayal so comprehensive and so carefully planned that the planning itself, preserved in the institutional language of internal business communication, is among the most disturbing things the Wasteland's archive has to offer. The corporation had a logo, a mascot, a jingle, and a philosophy that it had spent considerable resources communicating to the American public through every available channel of pre-war media. The philosophy was salvation. Vault-Tec presented itself as the institutional embodiment of American preparedness, the corporation that had taken seriously what politicians were only willing to discuss in the abstract, that had translated the theoretical possibility of nuclear war into concrete protective infrastructure, that had built the shelters that would carry humanity through whatever catastrophe the deteriorating international situation might eventually produce. Its advertising was cheerful, and its spokespersons were reassuring, and its public-facing communications maintained with considerable professional sophistication. The specific tone of competent benevolence that the pre-war public found most persuasive in institutions that were asking for their trust. The terminals of Vault-Tec's corporate headquarters, preserved in the ruins of a building in the capital wasteland that the bombs had damaged but not destroyed, contain the private face of this public philosophy, and the distance between the two faces is one of the most comprehensively documented gaps in the wasteland's entire terminal record. The corporation that had presented itself to the public as the guardian of human survival had been, in its internal operations, something considerably more complicated. An organization whose relationship to the welfare of the people it was supposedly protecting was instrumental rather than genuine, that had developed its Vault program not primarily as a humanitarian project, but as a research initiative, whose requirements happened to be most efficiently met through the design and administration of what appeared to the outside world to be humanitarian shelters. The experimental protocols preserved in the headquarters terminal network are among the most methodically disturbing documents in the wasteland, and their disturbance derives not from their content alone, but from their form. These documents were written in the institutional language of scientific research, the passive voice constructions and objective third-person formulations and clinical terminology that research institutions develop as a professional standard, and that have the specific effect of creating distance between the language of a document and the human reality it describes. A vault whose inhabitants were required to sacrifice one of their own annually to an automated system that threatened to destroy the entire population was not described in the experimental protocol as a vault designed to compel its inhabitants to murder. It was described as a facility implementing a study of compliance behavior under conditions of perceived collective resource scarcity, with mortality outcomes serving as the primary dependent variable. The difference between these two descriptions is not merely semantic. The clinical language was functional. It allowed the people who wrote it and the people who reviewed and approved it to process what they were authorizing as a scientific question rather than a moral one, and in doing so made the authorization possible in ways that honest description of the thing being authorized might not have. The meeting minutes preserved alongside the experimental protocols reveal the human beings behind the institutional language, not as monsters, which would be in its way a more comfortable account than the truth, but as professional people engaged in the ordinary activities of professional life. They reviewed budget proposals and debated statistical methodology and raised practical concerns about implementation timelines. They discussed the challenges of maintaining consistent experimental conditions across a network of facilities whose administrators would have varying degrees of information about the nature of the experiments they were administering. They considered the problem of what to do with experimental data that was generated by vaults whose populations had discovered the nature of their experimental variable and had responded in ways that compromised the integrity of the study. Design, in all of this discussion, conducted in the language of ordinary institutional business. The people who were being subjected to the experiments appeared primarily as variables, as the raw material of the research, rather than as the human beings whose lives and deaths the research was organized around. The training materials provided to vault overseers, also preserved in the headquarters terminal network, are remarkable for what they reveal about the corporation's understanding of the psychological demands that the overseer role would place on the individuals who occupied it. The materials acknowledged, in careful and indirect language, that overseers would be required to administer communities they understood to be experimental subjects, that they would know things about the nature of their vault's program that the general population was not permitted to know, and that the management of this asymmetry would be among the most significant challenges of their role. The techniques recommended for managing this asymmetry were drawn from the broader field of institutional psychology and adapted for the specific requirements of administering a long-term deception on a captive population. They included methods for redirecting residents' questions about the vault's operation in ways that preserved the questioner's sense of having received an informative response without actually providing information that might compromise the experimental protocol. They included frameworks for understanding and managing the emotional demands of the role in ways that prioritized institutional function over personal psychological well-being. They included, in one of the more candid passages in the entire document, explicit acknowledgement that some overseers would find the role difficult for reasons that the training program was not able to fully address, and that the corporation expected a degree of attrition among overseers who proved unable to manage the gap between their role's requirements and their own moral frameworks. Interspersed among these operational documents are the administrative records of an ordinary corporate workplace, the procurement orders, the personnel files, the internal communications about office logistics and departmental policy, and the thousands small organizational matters that any institution of sufficient size generates continuously, and that the terminal record preserved with the same impartiality. It extended to the experimental protocols. These ordinary documents are, in their way, as disturbing as the protocols themselves, because they demonstrate the degree to which the planning and administration of the Vault program's systematic betrayal of the people who trusted it was embedded in the operations of a normal workplace that the people who approved the sacrifice lottery at Vault 11 and the noise experiments at Vault 92 also attended departmental birthday celebrations and submitted expense reports and complained, in the informal language of interoffice messaging, about the reliability of the building's climate control systems, the capacity for institutional compartmentalization, that this implies the ability to maintain the ordinary social reality of a normal workplace alongside the administrative reality of what the Vault program was actually doing, is not unusual in the history of institutions that have conducted harmful activities under the cover of legitimate ones. But it is consistently striking because it challenges the intuition that the people responsible for large-scale harm must be, in some way, visibly different from the people around them. They were not. They were the people around them. The headquarters terminals also contain documents that reveal the specific timeline of Vault-Tec's internal knowledge about the impending nuclear exchange internal communications that reference the coming bombing campaign, in terms suggesting advanced knowledge considerably more specific than what was available to the general public. These documents are among the most damaging in the entire Vault-Tec record because they establish that the corporation that had built its public identity around preparing humanity for nuclear war had known, with reasonable precision, when that war was coming, and had used that knowledge not to improve the protective capacity of its vaults or to warn the populations it claimed to be protecting, but to ensure that the corporation's own senior personnel and their families would be housed in facilities whose experimental variables were considerably less immediately lethal than those assigned to the general population. The architects of the Vault program, who had designed experimental protocols that would condemn thousands of people to systematic suffering, had arranged their own survival with considerably more care than they had applied to the survival of the people whose protection they had been paid to ensure. Reading these terminals is an exercise in confronting what institutional power actually looks like from the inside, not as a dramatic expression of malevolence, but as the ordinary operation of a system that had developed the specific capacity to translate human lives into research variables without any of the institutional actors who participated in that translation being required to fully experience what they were doing as what it was. Vault 11 sits in the Mojave Desert, its entrance unremarkable from the outside, one more armored door set into the rock face, among the dozens of similar doors scattered across the wastelands landscape. Nothing about its exterior announces what its interior contains or what its terminal record documents. The story preserved in those terminals is not the story of a single dramatic atrocity, but of something slower and in certain respects more terrible. The story of what happens to a community over decades when it is placed in an impossible situation and given no way out except through a door it cannot bring itself to walk through. The terminal record of Vault 11 is exceptional among the Wastelands documentary archives for its completeness and its duration. The records span the entire operational period of the vault from its sealing to its effective depopulation, and they are written by multiple hands across multiple generations. Overseers whose official logs documented the vault's administration, community leaders whose meeting records documented the political processes through which the vault organized its most terrible business, and individual residents whose personal journals documented the experience of living inside a community that had made accommodation with the demand for annual sacrifice. Together, these records constitute something that no single document could provide: a layered portrait of a community's moral transformation across time, told from inside the transformation by the people undergoing it. The earliest terminals belong to the vault's founding overseer, whose log entries from the first weeks after sealing document the shock of the demand's arrival with a raw immediacy that the later records, written by people who had grown up with the demand as a feature of their reality, cannot replicate. The overseer had entered the vault believing, as everyone who entered the vault believed, that it was a shelter, a facility designed to protect its population through the nuclear exchange and whatever period of surface uninhabitability followed. The discovery that the automated system governing the vault's life support had issued a requirement that a human sacrifice be delivered annually to a chamber designated as the Overseer's Chamber, under threat of population-wide destruction, was a discovery that the Overseer's official log approached and retreated from across multiple entries before the language settled into something that could hold the reality it was describing. The attempts to find a technical solution to access the system's underlying programming, to identify whether the threat was genuine or a malfunction, to communicate with the Vault-Tec infrastructure for guidance that would never come, are documented with a methodical desperation that reflects both the Overseer's genuine effort to find an alternative and the mounting evidence that no alternative existed. The community meeting records that follow document the process by which Vault 11's population arrived at its decision to comply, and these records are among the most morally complex documents in the entire Vault terminal network. The debate was genuine, and it was serious people arguing with the full weight of their intellectual and moral resources about what the right thing to do was, what compliance would mean, and what refusal would mean, whether any principle was worth the lives that refusal might cost, and whether any outcome was worth the life that compliance required. The people who argued for compliance did not argue that killing one of their own was acceptable. They argued that the alternative, the deaths of everyone, was worse, and that the mathematics of 500 lives against one life produced an answer that no reasonable person could honestly dispute. The people who argued against compliance did not argue that their lives were worth more than those of the rest of the community. They argued that compliance with a demand to kill would transform the community into something that the lives saved by compliance would not be worth having saved, that there were things worse than death, and that becoming people who killed on command was one of them. Both sides of this debate were conducted in good faith, and the record of both sides is preserved in the meeting minutes with a completeness that does justice to the moral seriousness of everyone who participated. The election system that the community eventually developed to govern the selection of annual sacrifices was the product of this debate, and of the specific conclusion that the debate reached that if compliance was necessary, then the compliance should be administered in a way that was as fair and as democratically legitimate as a deeply illegitimate process could be made. The specific mechanisms of the election system evolved over the years and are documented across multiple iterations in the administrative records, and the evolution reveals something about how human beings adapt to moral demands that cannot be met without moral compromise. The early elections were conducted with genuine anguish, each one treated as the extraordinary event it was, with elaborate procedures designed to ensure transparency and prevent manipulation. By the middle period of the Vault's history, the elections had become institutionalized. They had their own established procedures, their own political culture, their own informal rules about what kinds of campaigning were acceptable and what kinds were not, their own professional administrators who managed the process with the competence and procedural regularity that any established institution develops over time. The anguish had not disappeared, but it had been metabolized into the institution, transformed from a response to an extraordinary event into one of the background features of ordinary life. The political dynamics that the sacrifice lottery generated are documented in the community meeting records, with a specificity that makes Vault 11's internal political history one of the most complete accounts of how a small community organizes itself around a resource of ultimate value, in this case, the resource of exemption from selection. Factions formed along lines that reflected the lottery's specific mechanics, with individuals cultivating political relationships specifically calibrated to maximize their protection. The terminals documenting these factional dynamics read, in passages stripped of context, like the records of a functioning democratic community engaged in the ordinary competition of political life campaigns, alliances, accusations of procedural impropriety, debates about whether the rules should be changed and who should have the authority to change them. The context that transforms these ordinary political records into something terrible is always there, running beneath the surface of the institutional language, visible in the specific stakes of the debates, even when it is not named directly. The individual journals, preserved alongside the official records, are what give the community political history, its human texture, the personal accounts of what it felt like, from inside, to live in a vault organized around the annual selection of a person to be killed. The resident who had survived 11 consecutive lotteries, and who documented each survival with a guilt that the official records could not contain. The political operative who had manipulated the selection process to protect the people they loved, and who documented the rationalizations they had developed to maintain their self-understanding as a person who had done what they had to do. The overseer in the Vault's middle period, who administered the lottery for 15 years, and whose terminal entries traced a gradual and losing engagement with the implications of that administration entries that became shorter and more formal over time, as if the overseer had learned to protect themselves from what they were writing by writing less of it. The 5 remaining inhabitants whose refusal of the final sacrifice triggered the revelation that the demand had never been real are not given much space in the terminal record beyond the moment of their refusal itself. The automated system's response to their refusal, the recorded message explaining that the sacrifice requirement had been a test of whether the Vault's population would prioritize collective survival over individual moral principle, and that the population had passed the test, and that the Vault's true purpose had been to study this question rather than to administer the consequence it had threatened, is documented in the overseer's log in language that is stripped of almost all editorial commentary. The log records the message and records the fact that at the time of the message, the Vault's living population consisted of 5 people, and then the log ends. What the 5 people thought about discovering that the entire history of their Vault's compliance had been conducted in service of a threat that was never real is not recorded, because none of them wrote it down, or if they did, the records have not survived. The silence of the terminal record at this point is its own form of documentation, the point at which the archive, which had recorded everything else with such comprehensive detail, reaches the boundary of what language can hold. The spore plants of Vault 22 grew in controlled conditions for years before they grew in any other way, and the researchers who cultivated them documented their progress with the careful optimism of scientists who believed they were doing genuinely important work. The early terminals of the Vault's agricultural research program are notable for their scientific enthusiasm, meticulous records of germination rates and yield measurements, and the specific environmental parameters that produced the most productive growth in the engineered plant-fungal hybrids that constituted the program's primary research focus. The researchers who wrote these logs were not working on a weapon. They were working on a food source, a biological system capable of producing reliable nutrition in the compromised soil conditions that post-war agriculture would face. And their investment in the project's success was the investment of people who believed that success would matter to the people who came after them. The anomalies began appearing in the logs approximately 3 years into the program's operation. Documented initially as outliers that the experimental design's statistical framework placed outside the range of significance, a growth rate that exceeded projections by a margin larger than variance could account for. A batch of specimens that had developed apparent structural modifications not present in the parent generation or predicted by the genetic parameters of the hybrid. A section of the research greenhouse, where other plant species introduced for comparison purposes had shown signs of biological stress that the atmospheric monitoring systems reported as inconsistent with any identified cause. Each of these anomalies was noted in the logs and assessed and filed in the category of results requiring further investigation, which in the language of research programs means the category of results that the current project timeline does not include resources to investigate properly. The moment when the anomalies ceased to be manageable, as outliers arrived with a specificity that the terminal record documents in real time, a single log entry in which the language shifts from the controlled optimism of earlier entries to something that reads like the first honest assessment, the researcher had allowed themselves to commit to the record. The spores were not behaving as engineered organisms. They were behaving as a species that had identified an ecological opportunity and was pursuing it with the efficiency of something that had not been designed for efficiency, but had arrived at it anyway through whatever process biology uses. When the conditions for expansion are present and the constraints that might limit expansion have been removed, the vault-sealed environment, which had been selected precisely because it allowed experimental conditions to be controlled with high precision, had provided exactly the conditions that uncontrolled expansion required: a closed system with no predators, no competing species capable of limiting proliferation, and a population of human beings whose biological chemistry the spores had, over the years of the research program, had extensive opportunity to assess. The subsequent logs document the progression of what the researchers came to call the contamination with the specific mixture of professional rigor and personal terror that the terminal record preserves as one of its most affecting registers. The scientific documentation continued even as the situation it was documenting became impossible to document scientifically. The measurements taken, the observations recorded, the attempts to identify containment protocols that might slow or stop the progression, all preserved in the formal language of research methodology, while the personal logs that run alongside the official record document what the formal language could not hold. The researcher, who spent the last functional days of the facility recording atmospheric spore concentrations by section so that anyone who came after would have the information they needed to avoid the worst affected areas. The section supervisor, who continued holding daily team meetings until the team could no longer be assembled, and who recorded in the official log with complete professional composure that the meeting for that date had been cancelled due to insufficient attendance. The entry that appears in one of the personal journals, and that consists of a single sentence, a description of what the researcher could see from where they were sitting, written with the spare attention to detail of someone who had decided that if they were going to write one more thing, it would be something true. The terminals of Vault 75, which occupied the space beneath a middle school in Malden, Massachusetts, tell a different kind of scientific horror story, one in which the catastrophe was not accidental but designed, not a consequence of work that had been done in good faith and gone wrong, but a program whose fundamental objectives required the harm it inflicted, and that had been administered by people who understood this and continued anyway. The Vault's experimental variable was the development of enhanced combat subjects through a program that combined genetic screening of the incoming population with physical conditioning regimens and psychological conditioning. protocols calibrated to produce soldiers from children who had been told and who believed that the vault would keep them safe. The clinical documentation of what the program actually did to its subjects is preserved in the Vault's research terminals, in the language of scientific measurement, the performance metrics for each cohort, the developmental benchmarks that define success and failure within the program's framework, the assessment criteria for the washout determination that was applied to subjects who did not meet the program's requirements. The washout determination is described in the terminal record in terms of subjects being transitioned out of the active research cohort, which is the language the program used for this process in all of its official documentation, and the reader of these documents must supply the knowledge of what this transition actually represented. This requirement that the reader complete what the document declines to state is itself a feature of the documentation's design, because the people who wrote these records had made a choice about how to describe what they were doing that was consistent with their choice about how to understand what they were doing, and both choices pointed in the same direction, which was away from honest description. The earliest researchers at Vault-75 documented, in personal logs that ran alongside their official research records, the tension between their professional training's ethical frameworks and what the program required of them. These early entries are notable for their engagement with the tension as a genuine problem. People genuinely uncertain about whether what they were being asked to do was consistent with the principles they had brought to their professional lives, documenting that uncertainty with the honesty of people who had not yet resolved it in the direction that continued participation would require. The later entries, those written by researchers who had been in the program long enough to have completed that resolution document, no equivalent tension, because the tension had been resolved through the mechanism that the program's institutional culture had developed for resolving it, which was the gradual substitution of the program's internal framework for the broader ethical frameworks with which researchers had arrived. By the time a researcher had been in Vault-75 long enough to write about their work without acknowledging what their work was, they had been inside the program's specific institutional reality long enough for that reality to have become their primary reference point for what was normal and what was acceptable. The program did not require its researchers to be monsters. It required them to stay, and staying did the rest. Interspersed through the Vault's official research documentation are records of the children themselves, not personal logs, because the children were not provided with terminals, but observational records written by the researchers who assessed their development. Records that had been intended as data collection instruments, and that function instead as the closest thing available to testimony about what the children in the program experienced. A researcher's notation that a particular subject had demonstrated reduced compliance with conditioning protocols following the separation from a sibling assigned to a different cohort. An assessment recording that a cohort's average performance had declined following the loss of a member to the washout process, and speculating about whether grief responses might be interfering with the conditioning timeline. A note in a behavioral log, written in the same clinical language as every other entry in the document, observing that a subject had asked where the washed-out members went and recording the response that had been provided according to the program's approved communication protocol. What the approved communication protocol said to tell children who asked where their friends had gone is not recorded in the entry, but the existence of an approved protocol for this specific question is itself a form of documentation about what the program knew it was doing and had prepared for children to ask about. The Nuka-Cola Corporation occupied a different position in the pre-war world's commercial landscape than Vault-Tec. It was a consumer products company rather than a defense contractor. Its relationship to the public, one of entertainment and refreshment rather than emergency preparedness. Its brand identity built around optimism and pleasure and the specific cheerfulness that its advertising had successfully associated with its product across generations of American consumer culture. The terminals of Nuka-Cola facilities scattered through the wastelands geography document, an organization that had, by the late pre-war period, grown so large and so institutionally complex that its left hand had developed the specific organizational incapacity to know what its right hand was doing that characterizes institutions of sufficient scale, while also having developed the specific institutional incapacity to care what its right hand was doing that characterizes institutions of sufficient profit. The development files for Nuka-Cola Quantum, preserved in the terminals of Nuka-Cola facilities across multiple locations, document a product development process in which the distinctive blue glow produced by the incorporation of strontium isotopes into the beverage formula was identified early as a significant marketing advantage, a visual differentiation from competitor products that market research suggested would be highly effective at attracting consumer attention. The terminals documenting the product's safety assessment process reveal the specific way that the corporation processed the information that a mildly radioactive consumer beverage raised potential health concerns, not as an ethical problem requiring an ethical response, but as a regulatory compliance problem requiring a regulatory strategy and a liability management problem requiring a legal strategy. The health assessment data was reviewed, assessed against regulatory thresholds that had been established for occupational exposure rather than consumer consumption, and determined to fall within acceptable parameters when the exposure was calculated on the basis of moderate consumption. The terminals documenting this determination are written in the language of responsible corporate stewardship, which is the language that institutions use when they have made a decision they wish to be able to describe as having been made responsibly. The Cambridge Polymer Lab's terminals tell a story of a research program that had been conducting legitimate and genuinely innovative materials science when a classified government contract arrived that redirected its capabilities toward objectives the lab's own researchers found concerning and documented their concern about in terms that reflect the specific professional dilemma of scientists whose institutional employment depends on conducting research they have ethical reservations about. The terminals documenting the transition from civilian to classified research are notable for the progressive shift in tone between the entries that precede the contract's arrival and those that follow it from the collegial enthusiasm of researchers engaged in work they had chosen toward the more careful, more guarded language of people who had learned that what they wrote about their current work would be reviewed by people with authority over their continued participation in it. The concerns that individual researchers documented were documented in personal logs rather than official communications, which is itself informative about what the researchers understood would and would not be acceptable to record in the institutional record. The personal logs, written in the assumption that they were private, say what the official communications, written in the knowledge that they were not, decline to say. This is the gap that the terminal record, through the accident of its preservation, has made permanently visible. The RobCo Industries terminals, distributed across facilities from the capital wasteland to the Mojave document, an organization that had become the dominant force in American robotics manufacturing, and that had, through that dominance, developed the specific institutional character of entities that have operated without meaningful competition for long enough that the feedback mechanisms normally provided by competition have ceased to function. The terminals documenting the Securitron development program reveal engineers who were genuinely proud of what they had built and who documented their pride in the specific language of professional achievement, alongside administrators who were managing the program's public presentation in ways that involved careful decisions about what information would and would not be included in the product's public documentation. The gap between what the engineers' terminals say about what the Securitrons were capable of and what the product's public-facing documentation said about what the Securitrons were capable of is not enormous in its specific dimensions, but is informative in its existence. The specific calibration of what was disclosed and what was retained that reflects an institutional culture that had learned to treat the management of information as a standard component of product development rather than a departure from it. There are things the terminal record cannot explain, and the existence of those things is itself a form of information that the record preserves without intending to. The Wastelands documentary archive is, in its dominant character, a record of human decisions, institutional and individual, deliberate and inadvertent, made in full awareness of their consequences, and made in complete ignorance of them, but always traceable, in principle, to the choices of people operating within the frameworks that human civilization had developed for making choices. The horror that most of the terminal record documents is comprehensible horror, which is to say it is horror produced by recognizable human capacities, greed, institutional inertia, the subordination of individual moral judgment to collective institutional purpose. The various mechanisms through which human beings develop the ability to make decisions about the suffering of others without experiencing that suffering as fully real. These are things that can be named and understood and, in principle, addressed. The terminals of Dunwich are different, and their difference is felt before it can be articulated, a quality in the writing of the people who left these records that is not quite the quality of any other terminal writing in the wasteland. A quality of people trying to use language that was not designed for what they needed it to do, and knowing, in some cases explicitly, and in others only by the increasing inadequacy of their attempts, that the language was failing them. The Dunwich Borers sits in the Commonwealth landscape as an industrial site of no particular distinction at first approach, a quarry operation whose pre-war equipment still occupies the terraced levels cut into the earth, whose administrative buildings still contain the terminals that managed its operations, whose history as a mining company extraction site is documented in the ordinary language of industrial administration that any such facility would generate. The early terminals of the Dunwich Borers are the terminals of a functioning business, production quotas and equipment schedules and personnel records, and the thousand small administrative documents that an operation of its scale and type would naturally produce. There is nothing in the earliest records to distinguish this facility from any other pre-war industrial site whose terminal network has been preserved in the wasteland. The language is the language of industrial management. The concerns are the concerns of industrial management. The people who wrote these early records were doing a job and recording the ordinary details of doing that job, and nothing in those records suggests that they were anywhere other than a mining operation conducting the ordinary business of extraction. The change in the records is gradual, which is the quality that makes it most affecting in retrospect, because the gradual quality means that the reader can observe the moment at which the ordinary begins to become something else, and watch the people experiencing that transition, trying to account for what they are experiencing within the frameworks that their ordinary understanding provides. The first anomalies are small enough to be filed under the category of ordinary workplace incident. A worker whose behavior following an injury sustained at depth had been reported to a supervisor as erratic in ways that the supervisor's log, described with the specific language supervisors use when they are not certain whether what they are observing constitutes a personnel problem or a medical one. An equipment malfunction in a lower level of the quarry, whose maintenance records show the repair being logged as completed and then appearing again in the next week's maintenance queue as recurring, with a notation from the technician who had attempted the repair that the cause of the malfunction had not been definitively identified, despite the repair appearing to resolve it temporarily. These early anomalies are unremarkable in isolation. Industrial facilities produce anomalous incidents continuously, and the administrative instinct of any functioning workplace is to categorize each anomaly within the nearest available normal category and address it according to the procedures that category implies. The Dunwich Borers administrators did this with professional efficiency, and the terminal record of those categorizations and responses looks, in the first months of documented anomaly, like the terminal record of any organization managing the ordinary unpredictabilities of a complex operational environment. It is only when the records are read across time, when the accumulated pattern becomes visible that no individual incident could have revealed, that the category of normal incident begins to feel inadequate to what the records are actually documenting. the personal logs of individual workers, preserved alongside the official administrative records in the way that the wastelands terminal networks so often preserve the private alongside the official, begin to document something that the official records are not designed to contain approximately 8 months into the period of documented anomaly. The specific experiences that workers were having at depth in the lower levels of the quarry where the extraction work had been proceeding were not experiences that the official records administrative language had, categories for, and the workers who were trying to process these experiences in their personal writing were confronting the same problem that anyone confronts when they try to use existing language for experiences that existing language was not made to hold. The attempts are visible in the writing, the reaching for metaphors that do not quite fit, the accumulation of qualifiers that reflects the writer's awareness that what they are saying is not quite capturing what they mean, the occasional abandonment of the descriptive attempt entirely in favor of simple documentation that something had happened that they were not able to describe accurately. What the workers documented was not a single type of experience, but a cluster of related experiences that appeared across multiple independent accounts written by people who, by the evidence of the terminal record, did not have access to each other's personal logs and were therefore not recording variations on a shared story, but apparently independent encounters with something that produced similar effects across different individuals. Dreams that multiple workers described in terms similar enough to suggest a shared quality rather than the ordinary variation of individual unconscious experience. A persistent sensory impression, reported by workers who had spent extended time in the lowest accessible levels of the quarry, of being observed from below, not from the surrounding walls of the excavation, but from below, from the stone beneath their feet, in a direction that the physical geography of the site should have made impossible as a source of observation, and the sounds. The accounts of sounds heard at depth, during certain phases of the work schedule and not others. Sounds that the workers' attempts at description placed in a category adjacent to, but not identical, with the category of geological settling or equipment vibration, or any of the ordinary acoustic phenomena that a quarry operation routinely produces. Sounds that had, in the accounts of multiple independent witnesses, a quality of intentionality that the geological and mechanical categories could not account for. The administrative response to these reports, when workers began making them through official channels, was the response that administrative systems reliably make to reports that fall outside their categories. The reports were received, assessed against the available frameworks for understanding workplace incidents, and addressed through the nearest applicable procedures. Workers who reported unusual experiences were offered assessment through the facility's occupational health protocols. The sections of the quarry associated with the most concentrated reports were flagged for additional structural review. A communication was issued, reminding workers of the facility's incident reporting procedures and encouraging anyone experiencing concerns about working conditions to bring those concerns through appropriate channels. None of these responses addressed what the personal logs documented as the actual content of the workers' experiences, because the administrative systems were not equipped to address what the personal logs documented, and because admitting that the systems were not equipped to address what was being reported would have required acknowledging that what was being reported fell outside the range of things that administrative systems were designed to address. The connection to the Dunwich building, a separate structure in the capital wasteland, associated with what appears to have been the same organizational network, adds a dimension to the Dunwich terminal record that the quarry's own documents do not provide a suggestion that whatever the Dunwich Borers was excavating toward had not been discovered accidentally in the course of a normal mining operation, but had been sought deliberately by an organization whose interests extended into territory that neither the quarry's administrative terminals nor the building's own records name directly. The patterns of language shared between the two locations' terminal networks, certain phrases, certain organizational references, certain ways of describing operational objectives that appear in both archives in forms too similar to be coincidental, suggest a connection that the documents themselves do not make explicit, which is the form in which the most significant connections tend to be preserved in institutional records. What the organization that connected these two locations was looking for, and what relationship that search had to the experiences documented in the quarry workers' personal logs, remains one of the wasteland's genuinely unresolved questions. Not unresolved for lack of documentation, but unresolved because the documentation that exists reaches exactly the point where resolution would require naming something that the language available to the people writing these records was insufficient to name. The final entries in the Dunwich Borers terminal network are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves as final entries or describe a culminating event whose nature would resolve the questions that the preceding records have raised. They simply stop, in the way that records stop when the people keeping them are no longer able to keep them, and the stopping is the only conclusion the archive provides. The pre-war military establishment generated documentation at a scale that reflected both the size of the institution and the specific institutional culture of military bureaucracy, which treats the production of records as both a professional obligation and a form of institutional protection. The documentation that establishes that procedures were followed, that orders were transmitted and received, that the chain of command functioned as it was designed to function, even when what the chain of command was transmitting and receiving were orders whose consequences would eventually constitute one of the largest catastrophes in human history. The military terminals scattered across the wasteland's various installations represent a fraction of the documentation this establishment produced, and that fraction is itself enormous. A distributed archive of operational records, research files, communication logs, and administrative documents that collectively constitute one of the most comprehensive accounts available of how the pre-war world prepared for and ultimately executed its own destruction. The West-Tec research facility terminals document the development of the forced evolutionary virus from its earliest iterations as a broad-spectrum vaccine candidate through the various phases of its transformation into something considerably more strategically significant than a vaccine. The early research logs are the logs of scientists working on a medical problem, the challenge of developing immunological protection against the range of biological threats that military planners had identified as likely components of the conflict they were preparing for. The language of these early entries is the language of medical research, organized around the concepts of efficacy and safety, and the particular standards that medical research had developed for demonstrating both. The scientists who wrote these entries were engaged in the work of the project with the professional investment that scientists bring to problems they find genuinely interesting. And the terminals document that investment with the specific enthusiasm of researchers who believed that what they were developing would protect people. The shift in the research's direction is documented in the West-Tec terminals across a period of approximately 2 years. And the documentation of that shift reveals the specific mechanisms through which military research programs transform their objectives, without necessarily transforming the understanding that the researchers involved have of what they are doing. The change in the program's strategic framing, from the development of a protective vaccine to the investigation of the virus's potential for human enhancement in directions that had clear offensive applications, arrived through the mechanism of contract modification and revised performance metrics, rather than through any explicit redirection of the scientists' professional objectives. The researchers continued to think of themselves as working on immunological problems, because the problems they were asked to solve were framed as immunological problems, and the fact that the immunological problems they were asked to solve had been selected because their solutions would produce effective biological weapons was a layer of the program's operation that the contract structure had been specifically designed to keep at a remove from the scientists' immediate working reality. The terminals documenting the later phases of the FEV program after the research had been transferred from West-Tec to military control, and the civilian researchers had been replaced by, or supplemented with, personnel whose institutional frameworks were more explicitly oriented toward weapons. Applications reveal a different kind of documentation, one in which the therapeutic framing had been largely set aside, and the operational framing had become primary. The subjects of the research appear in these later terminals in the language that military research uses for its subjects, which is the language of operational parameters rather than patient welfare, and the progression of the work is documented in terms of enhancement factors and combat effectiveness projections rather than the medical metrics that had organized the civilian research phase. The transformation of the FEV program from a medical research project to a weapons development program is visible in the terminal record as a change in language, because the change in language reflected a genuine change in the institutional understanding of what the program was, and the institutional understanding was what determined how the program was documented. Fort Constantine's terminal network documents a different dimension of the military's pre-war operations, not the development of biological weapons, but the administrative management of nuclear ones, and the specific bureaucratic architecture that the pre-war military had constructed to govern the authorization and potential deployment of weapons whose use would constitute a civilizational scale event. The terminals of the facility document launch authorization protocols, communication verification procedures, redundancy systems designed to prevent unauthorized use, and the various administrative layers that the nuclear command structure had accumulated over decades of refinement. These are not dramatically horrifying documents in their specific content. They are the records of a bureaucratic system, doing what bureaucratic systems do, establishing procedures, verifying compliance, maintaining the operational readiness of a function that its administrators hoped would never actually be required to operate. What makes these terminals disturbing is not what they say, but what their existence implies. The bureaucratic normalization of nuclear weapons management, the conversion of the capacity for civilizational destruction into a system of procedures and protocols and compliance checks that could be administered by ordinary personnel following ordinary institutional processes, represents a form of the compartmentalization that the terminal record documents across multiple domains. The people who maintained Fort Constantine's launch authorization systems were not people who thought daily about what it would mean for those systems to be activated. They were people who maintained systems, and the systems happened to be ones whose activation would end the world, and this fact was present in the background of their professional reality without being present in the foreground of their daily work. The terminal record of a facility dedicated to managing the operational readiness of nuclear weapons looks, in its administrative character, almost exactly like the terminal record of any other specialized government facility. The same personnel management concerns, the same equipment maintenance schedules, the same compliance documentation and procedural verification and institutional record keeping that any complex facility with specialized functions generates continuously. The specific function that made this facility different from any other government installation is visible only in certain categories of documents. And even in those documents, it is rendered in the technical language that military bureaucracy uses for its specialized functions, which is a language that creates distance between the documentation and the reality it describes. The military communication terminals that survived the Great War in various installations across the wasteland constitute a category of documentary record that is unique in the archive, the record of an institution losing coherence. In real time, the communications sent and received, and then no longer received in the hours during which the nuclear exchange was occurring. These terminals document the specific experience of the command and control infrastructure of a military superpower, processing the information that the war it had been preparing for was actually happening. And the processing is visible in the changing character of the communications across the period of the exchange. The early communications of the exchange period are the communications of a system that believes it is managing a crisis, urgent, organized, following established protocols for emergency operations, reflecting the institutional assumption that the systems that had been built to manage this scenario would be adequate to managing it. The later communications are different. They are shorter. They acknowledge gaps in the information picture that the early communications had not acknowledged. They contain, in certain entries, the specific quality of institutional language under pressure that it had not been designed to withstand the formalisms beginning to break down. The procedural language losing its authority as the procedures it describes lose their applicability to the situation they were designed to address. And then they stop, not with a concluding entry that acknowledges the ending, but simply with the last entry that was written before there was no one left to write. The personal logs of the wasteland tell the story that the institutional records cannot tell, and they tell it in the register that no institutional record is designed to use the register of specific individual experience, unmediated by the professional obligations and organizational frameworks that shape everything that institutional documentation produces. The wasteland's personal terminals are the record of people who wrote for themselves because writing was how they processed what they were experiencing, or because they wanted to preserve something, or because the act of writing was itself a form of company in circumstances that offered no other kind. And these motivations produced a documentary record whose honesty is structural rather than voluntary, not the carefully calibrated honesty of institutional communications that have been reviewed for compliance with professional standards, but the messier, more complete, more revealing honesty of writing that was never going to be reviewed by anyone. University Point occupied a position in the Commonwealth landscape that was, before its destruction, one of the more stable and more genuinely functional small communities that the post-war world had managed to produce. The terminal records that its residents kept during the period of the siege that destroyed it constitute one of the most complete first-person accounts of a wasteland community's end available in the documentary archive. And their completeness is the specific form of tragedy that the terminal record sometimes produces, the meticulous documentation of a reality that destroyed everyone who documented it, preserved perfectly because the preservation mechanisms outlasted the people they were built to serve. The siege logs begin with the community's first awareness that a threat was approaching: the Sentinel reports, the council meeting records, the communications sent to neighboring communities requesting assistance that the neighboring communities were not in a position to provide. The early entries have the quality of crisis management that functional communities develop: organized, methodical, reflecting the specific competence of people who had built something worth defending and who were applying the full weight of their communal resources to the problem of defending it. The council meetings, documented in the administrative terminals during the siege's early period, are meetings in which real decisions were made by real people with real expertise in the challenges that wasteland community management presented, and the records of those meetings reflect the intelligence and the practical wisdom of people who had survived long enough and built something stable enough to be worth trying to hold. As the siege progressed, the terminal record documents what crisis does to the ordinary language of institutional administration, the way that the procedural frameworks of governance begin to bend under the weight of events that the frameworks were not designed to hold, the way that the formal language of meeting minutes begins to show the pressure of what is happening outside the rooms where the meetings are being held. The entries become shorter. The gap between entries becomes longer. The specific quality of the language shifts in ways that reflect the shifting balance between the community's resources and the demands being placed on them. And the personal logs that run alongside the official records document what the official records, even under pressure, continue to decline, to document the fear, the grief for the community members already lost, the specific and intimate detail of what it felt like to be inside a community that was losing the fight to survive. recorded by people who were writing in the knowledge that they might not have many more entries to write. The Covenant terminals, located in a settlement of apparent tranquility and careful cultivation, that the wasteland's geography made distinctive precisely because it was so unlike the wasteland's character, document a community whose relationship to its own institutional practice had reached a state of settled normalization that made the practice itself invisible to those inside it. The safe test administered at Covenant's entrance, a psychological screening protocol purportedly designed to identify synths, had been developed and implemented with the specific intention of protecting the community from infiltration by entities that its founders and administrators believed posed an existential threat. The terminals documenting the test's development and its ongoing administration reveal an institution that had, over time, organized its entire communal identity around the practice of threat identification, to the point where the practice had become the identity rather than a tool in service of a different, more fundamental identity. The most revealing terminals in the Covenant network are not the ones that document the safe test's administration, but the ones that document the community's internal discussions about its own operations, the conversations between community members about what they were doing and why they were doing it, and whether the methods they were using were consistent with the values they believed themselves to hold. These conversations are preserved in personal terminal logs rather than official communications, which tells something about the community's institutional culture, that these questions were not ones that the official framework had created space for addressing, and that the people who wanted to think about them had learned to think about them in private rather than in institutional contexts. The people who wrote these private reflections were not, by the evidence of the writing, people who had made peace with every aspect of what their community did. They were people who had found ways to continue participating in something whose full implications they had not confronted entirely, which is a human capacity that the terminal record documents with some consistency across the full range of the wasteland's institutions. The railroad switchboard terminals provide one of the more affecting counterpoints available in the wasteland's documentary record, the records of an organization that had defined its mission around the protection of beings, whose status as persons was contested by the most powerful organization in the Commonwealth, and that had continued pursuing that mission with the specific dedication of people who understood that the work might not be recognized as important by anyone with the power to recognize it as important. The personal logs of railroad agents preserved in the switchboard terminal network document the inner lives of people who had made significant commitments to a cause, whose ultimate success they could not guarantee, and whose immediate costs they bore personally and continuously. These are not the logs of people who found their work easy, or their purpose obvious, or their sacrifices unambiguous. They are the logs of people working through the difficulty of a commitment that required more than they had initially understood it would require, and continuing anyway, for reasons that they documented with an honesty that makes the documentation valuable in ways that the documentary record of more confident causes cannot quite replicate. The Andale community terminals represent a different register of the personal log's capacity for documentation, the records of a community that had developed a profound disconnection between the self-understanding its members maintained and the reality of what the community practiced, a disconnection so thoroughly institutionalized that it had become invisible from inside the community, even to those members who possessed sufficient intelligence and self-reflection to have been expected to see it. The terminals of Andale's residents document the ordinary concerns of a small community managing the challenges of post-war existence, and they do so in the language of people who understood themselves to be doing what was necessary for survival in a world that made survival difficult. The specific practices that made Andale what it was are present in the terminal record, not as acknowledged realities, but as absences, the things that the community's members did not write about, the sources of their community's sustainability that the writing systematically declined to name, the specific quality of not quite saying that the terminal reader encounters in entries that seem to be about ordinary community management and that reveal, in their patterns of avoidance, the presence of something being avoided, the logs that end without ending, the personal terminal entries that simply stop, not with a final entry that acknowledges the ending, but with whatever ordinary entry happened to be last, before the circumstances that produced the ending arrived, form their own category within the wasteland's personal record. A resident of a settlement that was later destroyed, whose last entry discussed a disagreement with a neighbor about the allocation of communal garden space, with no indication that the writer had any awareness that it would be their last entry. A researcher whose daily logs had documented years of scientific work, ending with an entry describing the routine data collection of an ordinary afternoon in a laboratory that the following day's events would render permanently non-functional. A child in a vault, whose supervised terminal entries had chronicled the ordinary developmental milestones of a childhood spent underground, ending at the age of 11, with an entry describing what they hoped to see when the vault door eventually opened. The entries that end in the middle of a sentence carry a weight that the complete ones do not, because they demonstrate most nakedly the arbitrary character of endings in the wasteland. The way that death arrived, not when the narrative called for it, but when it arrived, indifferent to whether the person experiencing it had finished what they were trying to say. The question of what makes a person had been contested in philosophy long before the Institute began conducting the research that made the question practically urgent, rather than merely theoretically interesting. In the centuries of philosophical discourse that preceded the Great War, the question had been addressed through arguments about consciousness, about the capacity for suffering, about the possession of rationality, about the continuity of identity across time, about the social recognition of personhood as a status conferred by community rather than inherent in biological fact. These arguments had produced genuine intellectual progress and genuine unresolved disagreement in roughly equal measure, and the pre-war world had managed to organize its legal and ethical frameworks around a pragmatic consensus that treated biological humanity as the operative criterion for personhood, while acknowledging in its academic literature that this consensus rested on foundations that were more conventional than philosophical. The Institute's development of Gen 3 synths demolished this pragmatic consensus by producing entities whose biological humanity was complete and whose claim to the full range of personhood's implications could not be addressed through the biological criterion without acknowledging implications that the Institute's institutional framework was not equipped to accommodate. The terminal network of the Institute, preserved in the facility's underground architecture beneath the Commonwealth's surface, is one of the most extensive and internally complex documentary archives in the wasteland, a record spanning multiple generations of researchers and multiple phases of synthetic development, organized according to the institutional frameworks of a scientific organization that had maintained continuous operation through 2 centuries of post-war isolation, and that bore, in its terminal record, the specific marks of an institution that had been talking to itself for a very long time. The Institute's researchers had not been without intellectual company. They had each other. They had the accumulated library of pre-war scientific literature that the facility's systems had preserved. They had the ongoing work of their various divisions to engage with, but they had been without external challenge for so long that the specific form of institutional insularity that develops in the absence of external challenge had become one of the defining characteristics of the organization's intellectual culture. The terminal record reflects this insularity in ways that are visible in the language of the documents themselves, a self-referential quality, a tendency to treat the Institute's internal frameworks as naturally authoritative rather than as one perspective among many, a consistent pattern of describing the facility's work in terms that assumed the validity of its own premises, without acknowledging that those premises might be contestable from outside the framework they constituted. The earliest synthetic development terminals in the Institute's archive document research that is, in its initial framing, straightforwardly an engineering project, the development of robotic systems capable of performing specific functions that the Institute's operational requirements had identified as necessary. The Gen 1 synths are documented in these early terminals as mechanisms, which is what they were: sophisticated mechanisms, genuinely innovative in their engineering, but mechanisms in the specific sense that their design and assessment involve no dimension of concern for the system's own experience of its operation, because the systems were not understood to have an experience of their operation. The language of these early records is the language of mechanical engineering applied to biological systems, and it is a language whose categories and assumptions the records apply, without apparent awareness that they might someday become inadequate to what the research was producing. The transition to Gen 2 development is documented as an iterative engineering progression, the improvement of specific performance parameters, the resolution of reliability issues identified in Gen 1 deployment, the expansion of the behavioral repertoire available to synthetic systems that the Institute's growing operational requirements were demanding. The Gen 2 terminals are more complex than the Gen 1 records, but not qualitatively different in their essential character. They are still the records of engineering work, organized around engineering questions, assessed against engineering standards. The entities being developed appear in these records as systems being optimized, which is the appropriate language for the relationship the researchers had to their work at this stage, because the relationship was genuinely the relationship of engineers to their systems. The Gen 3 development terminals are where the qualitative shift becomes visible, and it becomes visible not through any dramatic announcement, but through the specific, incremental, and in some cases, apparently unconscious changes in the language that different researchers began using to describe their work at different points in the development process. The biological engineering that produced Gen 3 synths, the development of synthetic entities whose physical construction was indistinguishable from biological human beings at every level of analysis then available, created a situation in which the engineering language that had been adequate for earlier synthetic development became progressively less adequate, and the researchers who were most directly engaged with the Gen 3 subjects were the ones in whose terminals this inadequacy first became visible. A research log that describes a Gen 3 subject's response to an experimental parameter in terms that acknowledge the subject's apparent distress as a relevant variable, rather than simply an anomalous reading to be accounted for. A developmental assessment that notes a subject's expressed preference about a research protocol in language that stops just short of treating that preference as a consideration with ethical weight while acknowledging its existence, with a specificity that the pure engineering framework would not have required. These are small shifts in language, and the terminals in which they appear were almost certainly not written with any awareness that the language was shifting. But language shifts when the reality being described exceeds the categories available to describe it. And the Gen 3 development terminals document this process of exceeding with a granularity that makes the Institute's archive one of the more philosophically significant bodies of documentation in the wasteland. The terminals documenting the synth replacement program are written in a different register from the development records, the operational language of a program in regular execution rather than the investigative language of research. In progress, targets are designated and assessed. Replacement units are prepared and deployed. Transitions are evaluated against operational criteria and documented accordingly. The human beings who are replaced appear in these operational records in the specific way that targets appear in operational records, which is to say, they appear as problems with parameters rather than as people with lives. And the operational records do not acknowledge any tension between this mode of appearance and the full reality of what they are describing, because operational frameworks are not designed to acknowledge such tensions. The people who administered the replacement program and wrote its operational documentation were the same people whose other terminals reveal them to be complex individuals with professional pride and personal relationships and the full range of inner life that the terminal record attributes to the researchers and administrators of the Institute. The specific compartmentalization required to administer a program that terminated the lives of real people while maintaining the self-understanding of a scientist engaged in legitimate research is not unique to the Institute. The terminal record documents equivalent compartmentalization across multiple other institutions in the Wastelands archive, but it is visible in the Institute's operational terminals with particular clarity because the Institute's overall documentary record is extensive enough to permit the comparison between the operational records and the personal ones that reveals the compartmentalization structure. Father's private terminal entries are among the most carefully written documents in the Institute's archive, in the specific sense that careful writing reflects a person who is aware that what they are writing is significant and who is attending to that significance in the act of writing itself. The public communications of the Institute's director were written in the institutional language of institutional leadership, authoritative, measured, organized around the priorities of the organization and its stated mission. The private entries are different. They document a person whose understanding of what the Institute had become was more complex and more honest than the institutional language of his public communications allowed, and who worked through that complexity in the private record with a specificity that the public language systematically foreclosed. The entries in which Father addressed, in direct terms, the question of what the synths that the Institute had created actually were, whether the philosophical arguments for their personhood were arguments that he found compelling and chose to set aside in service of institutional objectives, or arguments he found genuinely resistible, or arguments he had simply never fully confronted, are among the most significant in the entire archive, not because they resolve the question, but because they document the specific quality of a very intelligent person's relationship to a question they have powerful, institutional reasons not to answer honestly, which is its own form of information about both the person and the institution. The big empty was not supposed to be what it became, which is one of the things that the terminal record of the Old World Blues research complex makes clear about an institution whose public history, such as it was, had been organized around an account of its purposes that bore only partial relationship to what those purposes had actually produced. The facility had been, in the pre-war period, a research installation of genuine scientific distinction, a place where the concentration of talent and resources and operational autonomy had produced work across multiple fields that the broader scientific community had recognized as significant contributions to human knowledge. The terminals documenting this legitimate period of the facility's operation reflect the specific institutional character of scientific organizations that have been given the resources and freedom to pursue ambitious research without the constraints that most institutions impose on their research programs. And the reflection is in many respects an attractive one. The enthusiasm, the collegiality, the genuine excitement of people doing work they find important in an environment that supports them in doing it. These are the terminals that document what the big empty was before it became what it is in the wasteland. The transformation of the facility into what the wasteland's survivors encounter when they find it began not with a single catastrophic event, but with the accumulated effect of a specific institutional evolution, the progressive removal of the constraints that had governed the research program's relationship to its own methods and objectives. The think tank, the collective entity formed by the consciousness transfers that converted the facility's senior researchers from biological humans into robotic containers for their cognitive functions, did not emerge from a process of deliberate self-transformation in the direction of unethical research. It emerged from a process of progressive, institutional isolation, combined with the specific transformation that the consciousness transfer had worked on the researcher's psychology. A transformation that the terminal record documents as having preserved the intellectual functions of the people who underwent it, while eliminating or severely compromising the emotional and ethical ones that had previously moderated the relationship between intellectual capability and its application. The think tank's self-documentation is unlike any other body of terminal writing in the Wastelands archive, and its uniqueness derives from the specific nature of the entities doing the writing, beings who retained sufficient cognitive function to write extensively and articulately about their work and their situation, who retained the professional vocabulary and conceptual frameworks of their pre-transformation identities, and who had lost the capacity for the kind of self-reflection that might have allowed them to recognize the gap between what they believed themselves to be doing and what they were actually doing. The terminals in which the think tank members document their research are written with the specific enthusiasm of scientists deeply engaged with problems they find fascinating, and the fascination is genuine. The intelligence visible in these entries is not performed but real. The scientific interests they document are coherent and, in some cases, genuinely innovative. The pleasure they take in intellectual achievement is authentic in the way that intellectual pleasure is always authentic in the people who experience it. What the think tank's terminals do not contain is any acknowledgement that the work they document with such enthusiasm had consequences for entities whose experience of those consequences was relevant to how the work should be assessed. The lobotomite research, which produced creatures designed to be maximally useful as research subjects, by eliminating the psychological functions that would otherwise complicate their use, is documented in the think tank's terminals as an elegant solution to a genuine research challenge. The challenge of conducting certain types of research on subjects whose welfare considerations would otherwise constrain what research was possible. The elegance of the solution from the researcher's perspective is what the terminals celebrate, and they celebrate it with the specific professional satisfaction that scientists feel when they find an efficient solution to a difficult problem. The fact that the efficient solution involved the systematic destruction of the cognitive and psychological functions that had made the subject's people is present in the technical description of the procedure without being present in the ethical assessment of the procedure, because the ethical assessment of the procedure had been eliminated along with the emotional functions that would have produced it. The comedy that inhabits the think tank's terminals is inseparable from their horror, and the combination is one of the more genuinely strange qualities that the Wastelands documentary archive produces. The researchers had reduced themselves to brains in robotic containers and had continued, in that condition, to write about their work with the full complement of professional gravitas that their pre-transformation identities had developed across decades of scientific careers. They addressed each other with their academic titles. They documented their research contributions with the careful attribution that scientific culture requires for the proper management of intellectual credit. They expressed frustration with the institutional processes that governed their research programs in the language of researchers who believed those institutional processes existed within a broader framework of scientific governance that they were obligated to respect and that had the authority to constrain them. All of this professional apparatus had been maintained by beings who had removed themselves from every external constraint that would have given it meaning, operating in a facility that had been entirely isolated from the scientific community whose conventions they continued to observe, documenting research for an audience that consisted only of each other, in records that the Wastelands survivors would eventually find and read 2 centuries after the civilization that had validated these professional forms had ceased to exist. The specific absurdity of this situation is visible in the terminals, without the terminals being aware of it, which is the condition that produces comedy at its most complete. The sync's residential terminals, located in the living quarters section of the Big Empty, where the player eventually establishes a base of operations, contain the personal records of the researchers who had worked in the facility before the transformation, the domestic details of extraordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances, shopping lists for items that would have been delivered from the facility's supply systems, notes about personal projects unrelated to the research work, observations about interpersonal dynamics among colleagues in the specific private language that people use when they are writing for themselves and not for anyone else. These records document the human beings that the think tank had been before the procedure that made them what they became, and the humanity they document is detailed and specific and entirely recognizable, the same range of preoccupations and pleasures and minor frustrations and genuine enthusiasms that characterize any group of intelligent people working together in an isolated environment. The distance between these human records and the think tank's post-transformation terminals is one of the more quietly devastating gaps in the entire Wasteland archive, because it makes the loss of what the transformation eliminated visible in the specific terms of what had existed before. The Wasteland's terminal record has been read in fragments by scavengers looking for tactical information, read more carefully by those few individuals whose circumstances gave them both the time and the motivation to attend to what the terminals actually contained, read with the specific attention that the railroad and certain institute researchers and certain independent scholars scattered through the Wasteland's communities had devoted to understanding what the pre-war world had actually been, rather than what the mythology of it had preserved. What all of this reading has produced, across the 2 centuries since the terminals stopped being written to and began being read, is a body of understanding that is more honest and more complete than any understanding of the pre-war world that its own inhabitants had been able to develop, because the pre-war world's inhabitants had been inside. The institutions whose true character the terminals document, subject to the information management that those institutions had practiced, looking at the public face rather than the private record. The most important conclusion that careful reading of the terminal archive supports is not that the pre-war civilization was simply evil, because it was not simply evil, and because the simplicity of that conclusion would be less useful than the more complicated truth. The civilization that produced the Vault experiments and the FEV program and the replacement protocols also produced the researchers who refused to continue programs they found unconscionable, the employees who raised concerns through official channels in the knowledge that raising them would be professionally costly, the individuals who used their access to institutional resources to do small acts of good that the institution had not authorized and would not have approved. These acts are present in the terminal record alongside the atrocities in a proportion that reflects accurately the proportion in which they existed in the reality the terminals document, which is to say, they are less numerous, they are less visible, they are consistently overwhelmed by the institutional forces that the atrocities reflect, but they exist. Their existence is documented, and the documentation of their existence is evidence of something in the human beings of the pre-war world that the worst of what they produced was unable to eliminate entirely, a capacity for moral seriousness and individual refusal that persisted even in institutional environments specifically designed to discourage it. The terminals that documented individual acts of resistance and conscience are, in a sense, the most significant documents in the entire archive, not because they change what the archive as a whole documents. The atrocities are documented too thoroughly and too specifically to be altered by the presence of resistance to them, but because they establish that the people who participated in those atrocities were not simply the products of their institutions, were not simply executing the directives of systems too powerful to resist. They were people who had choices, even if those choices were constrained and costly, and the existence of the people who made different choices establishes that the choices existed. This is not a comfortable conclusion, because the discomfort of moral responsibility is exactly what the institutional frameworks that produced the terminal record's worst documents had been designed to manage. But it is the honest conclusion, and honesty about the past is one of the few genuine prerequisites for building something different in its place. The terminals that documented attempts to bear witness, to record honestly what was happening, in the knowledge that the record might never reach an audience, are the wasteland's clearest expression of a particular human impulse that the terminal record preserves across every category of documentation it contains. The researcher who documented their concerns about an experimental protocol in the careful language of a person who understood that they might be writing for a future reader who would need the information. The vault resident who recorded, in precise and unsparing detail, what the sacrifice lottery was doing to their community and what they believed should be known about it. The overseer who maintained a private record that contradicted the official log in every respect that the official log had been required to falsify, apparently for no audience other than the record itself. These people were performing an act of witness that had no guaranteed audience and that carried personal risk, and they performed it because they had concluded that honest documentation had value independent of whether the documentation reached anyone who needed it. The wasteland has found them. 2 centuries later, in the collapsed buildings and sealed vaults where they left their records, the wasteland has found them, and what they wrote can finally be read by someone who needed to read it. What reading these terminals leaves in the minds of those who read them carefully is not a resolved understanding of what went wrong with the pre-war civilization, or a clear program for ensuring that what went wrong does not go wrong. Again, the terminals are too honest for that kind of resolution, too detailed in their documentation of the human complexity that produced both the atrocities and the resistances, too specific in their demonstration of the ways that institutional frameworks can make moral clarity difficult, even for morally serious people, too thorough in their preservation of the gap between what the civilization said about itself and what it recorded about itself in private. What they leave instead is something more fundamental than resolution, a genuine encounter with the reality of the civilization that produced the wasteland, in its own words, from its own private record, without the mediation of mythology or the softening of retrospective narrative. This encounter is not comfortable. It is not meant to be comfortable. It is the specific form of knowledge that the terminal record uniquely provides, and its value lies precisely in the discomfort it produces, because the discomfort is the experience of truth working on understanding in the way that truth does when it is allowed to arrive without being managed. The survivors of the wasteland who have read these terminals carry something that those who have not read them do not carry, not superiority, because the knowledge the terminals provide is not the kind of knowledge that elevates the person who possesses it above those who do not, but responsibility, because understanding what produced the wasteland creates an obligation that ignorance of it does not. The obligation is not to prevent any specific recurrence. The wasteland survivors are not in a position to prevent the specific institutional formations that the terminal record documents, because those formations no longer exist. The obligation is more fundamental than that, and more difficult to build something in the ruins of what the terminals document that is more adequate to the best of what the human beings visible in those terminals were capable of, rather than something that replicates the worst. The children of the wasteland who grew up without terminals, who learned the pre-war world through rumor and ruin, and the stories of elders who had themselves learned it through rumor and ruin, developed a mythology of the traces, before time, that the terminal record does not support and cannot survive contact with. The mythology held that the pre-war world had been a kind of paradise, technically sophisticated and materially abundant, destroyed by a catastrophic failure of political will or by the malevolence of specific actors whose identification varied depending on who was telling the story. This mythology served real psychological functions for the communities that maintained it. It provided a clear narrative of fall and loss, an account of why the wasteland was the wasteland that located the cause in identifiable villains, rather than in the accumulated weight of ordinary human decisions made within institutional frameworks that made those decisions feel reasonable to the people who made them. The mythology was comprehensible in the way that the terminal record is not, because the terminal record's account of how the world ended is not a story with villains and victims arranged in the proportions that mythology requires. What the terminal record documents, with a comprehensiveness that the mythology cannot accommodate, is a civilization whose destruction was overdetermined, produced not by a single catastrophic failure, but by the interaction of multiple institutional pathologies that had been developing for long enough and had become entrenched, enough that no individual decision or series of decisions could have reversed them. The resource wars that preceded the Great War are documented in military and government terminals across multiple installations as a series of conflicts that each individual actor involved understood to be the product of forces largely outside their control, the resource scarcity that made conflict over remaining reserves rational from the perspective of the nation-states that pursued it, the escalatory logic that made each individual military decision seem reasonable in the context that preceded it, the domestic political pressures that constrained the decision-makers whose choices the international record documents. No single terminal in the Wastelands archive contains the entry of a decision-maker who wrote, in the private record, that they had chosen to end the world. What the archive contains instead is a vast record of decision-makers who wrote, in the private record, about the specific constraints and pressures and institutional imperatives that made the decisions they made feel like the decisions they had to make. The Yangtze terminals, recovered from a pre-war submarine that had spent 2 centuries submerged in Boston Harbor, offer one of the more concentrated expressions of this dynamic available in the Wastelands documentary record. The submarine's crew had received their orders through the proper channels of a military command structure functioning as it had been designed to function, and the terminal record of those orders and the crew's responses to them documents a chain of institutional behavior that was, at every step, procedurally correct. The commanding officer's personal logs, preserved in a terminal that the vessel's sealed environment had protected from the water that had found its way into other sections, document a person who had spent a career in military service and who understood, with the professional clarity of someone who had thought carefully about what their service required, exactly what they had been ordered to do and what doing it would mean. The logs do not document a person who had found a way to be at peace with this understanding. They document a person who had continued doing their job anyway, in the specific way that professional obligation and institutional loyalty can continue to govern behavior, even when the behavior's consequences have exceeded anything that the frameworks of professional obligation and institutional loyalty were designed to accommodate. The crew had done their duty. What their duty had required them to do is documented in the vessel's operational logs with the technical precision of military record keeping. And the technical precision is itself a form of information about the kind of civilization that could produce people capable of maintaining professional standards at the moment of civilizational destruction. The hub's early settlement records, far to the west in the ruins of what had been a California distribution center, document a different, and in certain respects, more hopeful dimension of the terminal record, the record of people who had survived the immediate catastrophe and were attempting to build something functional from its ruins, making decisions about organization and governance and the management of shared resources in the specific conditions of a world in which the institutional frameworks that had previously governed those decisions no longer existed. The hub terminals are the records of improvisation of people who knew what civilization had been and were trying to reconstruct its most essential functions from memory and salvage, and the accumulated practical wisdom of people who had kept themselves alive long enough to develop practical wisdom. These records are imperfect, and their imperfection is documented. The decisions that turned out to be mistakes are recorded alongside the decisions that worked, because the people keeping these records were trying to learn from what they were doing rather than to document their success for an audience that would never know about the failures. The caravan companies that eventually developed from the hub's early trading networks are documented in a dense archive of commercial records, route assessments, supply manifests, personnel files, contracts negotiated between parties who had developed the specific legal vocabulary of commercial exchange through the practical necessity of having terms that disputes could be resolved against. These commercial records are, in their character, among the more genuinely encouraging documents in the Wastelands archive, not because they document perfect behavior. The commercial record is as full of exploitation and bad faith as the institutional record of the pre-war world, but because they document the reconstruction of functional complexity from its ruins, the patient accumulation of the institutional infrastructure that makes sustained exchange possible. The caravaneers who negotiated these contracts and maintained these records were not trying to rebuild civilization as an explicit project. They were trying to run profitable trade routes, and the civilization was a byproduct, the accumulated effect of many individual decisions made for commercial reasons that happened, in aggregate, to produce the social infrastructure that all commercial activity requires and that all complex societies rest on. The followers of the apocalypse terminals represent the wasteland's most sustained attempt to do deliberately what the caravan records document as a byproduct, to preserve and transmit the accumulated knowledge of the Falls pre-war world as an explicit institutional mission, rather than as an incidental consequence of other activities. The early followers' terminals are the records of a founding generation that had made a specific philosophical decision about what the wasteland most needed from the people who were in a position to provide something to it. And that decision had been that knowledge, medical knowledge especially, but also the broader scientific and historical knowledge that the pre-war world had accumulated was the resource whose loss would be most costly and whose preservation would be most valuable. The founders had read enough of the pre-war record, or had learned enough from the people who had read it, to understand that the wasteland's greatest danger was not the physical devastation of the bombing, but the institutional forgetting that the bombing had accelerated the loss of the specific knowledge and the specific institutional practices that had allowed the pre-war world to support its population, a loss that the physical ruins made vivid, but that the recovery of those ruins would not by itself address. The followers' operational records document the specific challenges of running an institution dedicated to knowledge preservation in an environment that was actively hostile to institutional continuity, the raiding parties, the resource scarcity, the political pressures from larger and more powerful organizations that wanted the followers' capabilities without wanting the followers' independence, the internal disagreements about what the organization's mission required, and how much compromise was acceptable in service of institutional survival. These are not the challenges that the founding generation's idealism had fully anticipated, and the terminals, documenting how the organization navigated them, constitute a record of institutional adaptation under pressure that is valuable precisely because it is honest about the costs. The followers who wrote these records were not writing for posterity in the way that the pre-war world's institutional records had been written. They were writing because the organization needed operational documentation to function, and the functional documentation happened to preserve, in its margins and interstices, and in the personal logs that ran alongside it, a detailed account of what it actually looked like to try to do something good in the wasteland with the resources the wasteland made available. The medical logs preserved in followers' field stations, distributed across the Mojave and the broader western wasteland, document what the organization's principles looked like at the level of individual practice, the specific encounters between followers, medics, and the patients they treated, recorded with the clinical detail that medical documentation requires, and with the additional detail present in the personal logs of what those encounters felt like from the inside. The medic who had treated members of two opposing factions in the same week, and who documented, in the private record, the specific difficulty of maintaining the organizational neutrality that the followers' principles required when the people they were treating were enemies who would kill each other the following week. The researcher who had identified a treatment protocol that would have been significantly more effective with resources the field station did not have, and who documented the calculations involved in deciding how to allocate the resources that were available against a list of patients whose needs exceeded what the available resources could fully address. These are not dramatic records. They are the records of ordinary professional activity conducted under conditions that made ordinary professional activity genuinely difficult. And their value is in their specificity, the specific human texture of what it meant to try to hold to something in a world that offered many reasons not to. There are terminals in the wasteland that were written after the bombs fell by people who had not been inside vaults, who had survived the bombing and its immediate aftermath in the ruins of the world it had made. The early post-war personal logs that survive from the period immediately following the Great War, the first weeks and months and years, are among the rarest documents in the Wastelands archive, because the conditions that produced them were conditions in which survival consumed resources that record-keeping competed for, and because the preservation mechanisms that had protected the pre-war terminals had not been available to the people writing in improvised shelters and salvaged buildings in the smoking ruins of the world they had known. What survives from this period is fragmentary and unevenly distributed, but what survives is, in its character, unlike any other category of writing that the terminal record preserves. The person who had been, before the bombing, a middle school teacher, and who documented in careful entries over the first 6 months after the war what they were doing to keep the children in their immediate group alive, and what they were teaching them, and why they had decided that teaching was still something worth doing. The family whose terminal had survived in a reinforced basement, and whose records documented the first winter after the bombing, with the specific attention of people who understood that the record might be the only thing that survived them, and who wanted whoever found it to know exactly what had happened to them and what they had done to try to hold on. The survivor who had been a civil engineer, and whose post-war terminals documented a systematic assessment of which pre-war infrastructure remained salvageable, and what its salvage would require records that read, in their methodical practicality, like the notes of someone who had decided that grief was a resource they could not afford, and that the most useful thing they could do with their particular knowledge was to apply it to the problem of what came next, leaving the grief in the silence between the entries, where it is nevertheless present for any reader who attends to it. These are the terminals that close the distance between the pre-war archive and the wasteland that grew from its ruins. The records that mark the moment where the civilization, whose private face the terminals had preserved, became the devastation whose legacy the wasteland's survivors had inherited. Reading them in sequence with the pre-war records produces an experience of continuity that the mythology of before and after obscures the recognition that the people who wrote the post-war records were the same people, or the children of the same people who had written the pre-war ones, and that what they had lost was not an abstract civilization, but the specific world that the specific people in the specific terminals had inhabited. The institutional horror documented in the Vault experiments and the FEV program and the replacement protocols becomes, read in this continuity, not the story of a civilization that deserved its fate, but the story of a civilization that contained, alongside its worst institutional expressions, the same human beings whose post-war records document the persistence of decency and practical wisdom, and the specific refusal to stop trying that the worst of what their institutions had done had not managed to extinguish. These are the same people. The terminals know this. The reader who has read all of them knows it too. The terminals that document grief are among the most quietly devastating in the entire archive, and they are devastating in proportion to how ordinary the grief they contain is, how entirely recognizable, how completely unmarked by the extraordinary circumstances in which it was experienced. The wasteland's popular imagination, such as it is, tends toward the dramatic registers of the pre-war record, the institutional atrocities, the scientific horrors, the military catastrophes. These are the stories that travel. that get retold around fires in the settlements and passed between travelers on the long roads between communities. They are the stories that feel like they mean something, that carry within them the satisfying weight of lessons about power and corruption and the wages of institutional indifference to human consequence. The terminals that document ordinary grief carry none of this satisfying weight. They document instead the specific experience of people losing the specific people they loved, in circumstances that the pre-war world's last years provided in abundance. And the documentation is devastating precisely because it requires nothing from the reader beyond the willingness to recognize what is being described. The spouse who continued writing in a shared journal terminal after the other person stopped continued writing to them in the second person, as if the writing itself could sustain the relationship that death had ended. Not the elaborate second person of someone performing grief for an imagined audience, but the specific, habitual second person of someone who had been in the practice of addressing this particular terminal to this particular person for long enough that the practice continued after the person it was addressed to was no longer present to receive it. The entries are about ordinary things, the management of the household, the news from the neighborhood, the progress of the garden that had apparently been a shared project across years of the couple's life together. Nothing in them acknowledges that the person they are addressed to cannot read them. And this non-acknowledgement is not denial in any psychological sense, but something more functional and more affecting the continuation of a conversational relationship whose other participant is gone, sustained by writing because writing was the form it had taken and writing was what remained available. The parent who began a terminal record for a child who would never read it, writing entries addressed to an infant in language that anticipated a future reader who would be older and would want to know what the world had been like when they were small, entries that documented the ordinary milestones of early childhood with the specific affection and the specific humor that parents bring to the record of their children's development, and that were written in the years immediately before the bombing, in a world that gave no reliable indication it was about to end. The child in these entries was learning to walk, was saying first words, was developing the specific personality that would have been theirs if the world had continued long enough to allow it. The entries do not end dramatically. They end in the way that most terminal records end, simply stopping. The last entry concerned with something entirely ordinary, carrying no indication that it would be the last. What makes these entries different from other terminal records that end without ending is that the specific address to a future reader who never existed, the accumulated anticipation of a relationship that the bombs prevented, gives the ending a quality of loss that is not only the loss of the person who wrote the entries, but the loss of the person the entries were for. The person who would have read them and laughed at the stories about their early stumbling attempts at words and their strong opinions about specific foods and their habit, documented across multiple entries with evident parental delight of falling asleep in specific inconvenient locations. These records exist alongside the institutional horrors and the military terminals and the research logs and the administrative documents, preserved by the same mechanisms that preserved everything else, available to the same readers who find the other things. They do not fit comfortably into the categories that the wasteland has developed for understanding the pre-war record. They are not evidence of institutional failure or corporate malfeasance or the bureaucratic normalization of mass destruction. They are evidence of something that requires none of those frameworks to understand, that requires only the recognition that the people who lived in the pre-war world were people, in the specific sense that grief gives to that word beings whose interior lives contained attachments, whose loss was experienced as loss, whose experience of the world was organized around the specific other people they loved in it, and who were therefore vulnerable in the most fundamental way that human beings are vulnerable to the removal of those people. The Wastelands documentary archive contains this evidence in quantities that no complete reading of it could fail to encounter, and the encounter changes something about how the other evidence is received. The institutional records look different when they are read alongside the grief terminals, not different in their content, which is what it is, and cannot be altered by context, but different in the specific dimension of their human weight. The experimental protocol that described the Vault-11 sacrifice system in the language of behavioral science was written by people who had grief terminals somewhere in their personal records, or who would have if they had written personal records. Because the people who wrote the experimental protocols were the kind of people who had spouses and children and parents and friends and the ordinary attachments that produce ordinary grief when they are lost. The protocol does not become less terrible in this light. Nothing in the terminal record becomes less terrible when it is read in the light of the grief terminals. But it becomes more completely terrible because it becomes the work of people who were fully human in the most intimate senses of the word, and who had, through whatever combination of institutional pressure and professional socialization and the accumulated mechanisms of compartmentalization that the terminal record documents across so many domains, developed the capacity to write in one register about their experimental subjects, and in another register entirely about the people they themselves loved and lost. The love letters in the terminal record deserve their own accounting, and they have not received it, because love letters seem like marginal documents in an archive that contains the records of civilizational atrocity and the private communications of the people who produced it. They are not marginal. They are among the most important documents the archive contains, not because of what they reveal about the pre-war world's institutions, or its politics, or its trajectory toward destruction, but because of what they reveal about the quality of the interiority that the bombs destroyed, the specific texture of what it meant to be alive in the pre-war world, in the register that love produces in people for whom it is. Functioning as love is designed to function. The love letters are not all well written. Many of them are not well written by any conventional literary standard, which is one of the things that makes them valuable as evidence of what they are evidence of. The person who is writing a love letter in the expectation that only the person they love will read it is not writing for any literary standard, is not organizing their expression for the effect it will have on an uninvested reader, is not performing the emotion they are documenting, but documenting an emotion they are experiencing without any of the mediating purposes that most writing serves. The result, in the best cases, is writing of extraordinary specificity, writing that describes a specific person as they appear to the person who loves them, which is a form of description that no other perspective can produce. And that captures in that specificity something about the texture of a specific life as it was experienced by another specific life that no other form of documentation could have preserved. The beloved in a love letter is not a figure in an institutional record, or a subject in a research protocol, or a variable in an experimental design. They are the specific person that the person who wrote the letter was in love with, rendered in the specific light of that love. And what is preserved in the letter is not only information about the beloved, but the quality of the perception that the love produced, the way that love changes what is seen and how it is seen, and what about what is seen matters most. The grief letters and the love letters taken together constitute the archive's most direct access to what the pre-war world felt like from inside the kind of life that most of its people actually lived, not the institutional life, which the official records document with considerable thoroughness, and not the dramatic life of the decisions that shaped the civilization's trajectory, which the classified communications and the research protocols document with an honesty they did not intend, but the intimate life, the daily life organized around the specific attachments and the specific losses and the specific pleasures of existing in relation to other people who are known in the particular way that long familiarity and genuine affection make possible. This life is not fully recoverable from the record it left. Nothing that exists only in the experience of living can be fully recovered from any record of it. But the record gestures toward it with sufficient specificity that the reader who attends to it encounters something genuinely different from what the institutional archive offers a sense of the civilization's interior that the exterior record, however comprehensive, cannot supply. There is a terminal in the ruins of a house in the Commonwealth, not a significant house, not a house associated with any of the events or people or institutions that the wastelands historians attend to, that contains a single entry written the evening of October 22nd, 2077. The entry is not long. It describes the day that the person who wrote it had spent an ordinary day, by the account, involving errands and a conversation with a neighbor and the preparation of a meal that had apparently turned out better than expected. The entry notes, near its end, that the evening was pleasant, that the person writing it had sat for a while after dinner looking out at the sky, which had been clear, which had apparently been a source of simple pleasure. There is nothing in the entry to suggest that the person who wrote it had any awareness of what the following morning would bring. There is nothing in it to suggest anything other than what it documents, which is an ordinary evening at the end of an ordinary day, in a life that was, by the evidence of this entry, not a remarkable life in any of the senses that history uses the word remarkable, but a life that contained within it the specific quality that all lives contain when they are being lived by people who notice that an evening sky is clear and find in that noticing something worth sitting with for a while. The entry ends. The terminal continues to display it, as it has been displaying it for 2 centuries, to anyone who finds the house and manages to power the machine. The sky that the person was looking at when they wrote it has been the sky of the wasteland for 200 years, altered in its composition and its character by everything that happened the following morning. The house around the terminal is damaged in the ways that houses in the Commonwealth are damaged, not destroyed, not rendered unrecognizable, but bearing in its structure the evidence of 2 centuries of weathering and the specific violence that the wasteland applies to things left untended in it. The terminal glows, the entry remains. The person who wrote it is gone in all the ways that 200 years makes people gone, and the evening they were describing when they wrote it is gone in all the ways that the morning that followed it made evenings gone. And what remains is the writing, which is exactly what it was when it was written. The record of someone sitting with the simple pleasure of a clear sky on an ordinary evening at the end of the world. This is the most essential thing that the terminal archive preserves, and it is preserved not in spite of the archive's institutional character, but through the accident of the archive's comprehensiveness, its indiscriminate preservation of everything that was written to it, without editorial selection or archival judgment, without any distinction between what was significant and what was not, because the machines that preserved these records were not designed to make those distinctions. They preserved everything, and in preserving everything, they preserved the specific record of a specific, ordinary evening, written by a person who did not know they were writing the last ordinary evening that the civilization they had lived their entire life inside would ever have. The Wasteland's wanderers who find this terminal and read this entry are reading something that was not written for them, that was not written for anyone, that was written in the completely private way of someone making a small record of a pleasant evening for no reason more significant than that the evening was pleasant and worth noting. The fact that it has survived to be read by someone who was not its intended audience, by someone who was not, technically, its audience at all, is one of the specific forms of grace that the Wasteland's documentary record occasionally produces. The unexpected preservation of something whose value was entirely invisible to the people who built the systems that ended up preserving it. What the complete terminal archive amounts to, read with the attention it deserves and the patience that attention requires, is not a history of the pre-war world in any conventional sense. It is something more and less than history more, because it contains a directness of access to the human reality of the pre-war world that no historical account constructed after the fact could replicate, and less, because it contains that access without the interpretive framework that history provides, without the organizing narrative that makes the contents of an archive legible as a story rather than as an accumulation. The reader who approaches the archive looking for a story will find the materials for many stories and the complete version of none of them. The reader who approaches it willing to sit with incompleteness, willing to hold the grief terminals, alongside the experimental protocols, alongside the love letters, alongside the launch authorization procedures, alongside the ordinary evening entry, and not demand that these things resolve into a single, coherent account of what the pre-war world was. This reader receives what the archive actually offers, which is something that no resolved account could contain. The wasteland wanders through the ruins of a civilization that documented itself with extraordinary thoroughness in the assumption that the documentation would serve institutional purposes that no longer exist, and that in failing to serve those purposes has become instead the most intimate and most complete record of human life that has ever been accidentally preserved. The blinking cursors in the empty rooms are not waiting for the institutions that created them to return to claim their records. Those institutions are gone in ways that no continuation could address. The cursors are waiting in the only way that machines wait, for the next person who walks into the room where they have been blinking since the civilization that created them ended, who powers the terminal if it needs powering, who reads what is on the screen, who encounters across 2 centuries of silence the person who was looking at a clear sky on an ordinary evening and thought it worth writing down, and who recognizes, in that small act of notation, something that the bombs and the centuries have not managed to make unrecognizable. Someone always comes. That is what the archive has learned across the 200 years of its patient preservation, if archives can be said to learn anything. Someone always comes, eventually, to the collapsed building and the sealed vault and the abandoned house. Someone always finds the terminal still glowing in the dark. Someone always reads what is on the screen. The pre-war world wrote in the assumption of an institutional audience that no longer exists, and received instead an audience it never anticipated and could not have imagined, the people of the wasteland, who carry in their daily lives the consequences of everything the archive documents, and who read the archive to understand those consequences with a directness and an urgency that no pre-war institutional reader was ever required to bring. These are the readers the archive deserved. These are the readers, 2 centuries delayed, who finally arrived. Rest now, wanderer, and let the green glow of the wasteland's patient screens fade into the darkness behind your eyes. The terminals you have visited tonight are still out there, still blinking in the collapsed rooms and sealed vaults of a world that has been gone for 2 centuries, still holding the words of people who wrote in the assumption that no one would ever read them. Someone has read them. Someone always does, eventually, in the wasteland where everything that survived the fire is waiting to be found. Let the weight of what has been read settle quietly, without urgency, the way that truth settles when it has been given enough time and enough space. The records have been honored. The voices that wrote into silence have been heard. Close your eyes now, and let the long, patient dark of the wasteland's night hold you gently, as it holds everything that endures within it. The cursor blinks, the screens glow, the words remain, waiting for the next reader who finds them in the ruins, patient and luminous and utterly undimmed by time. Sleep now, child of the wasteland. I'll add a new section before the final outro paragraph.